Ladies and gentlemen, we'll get started. Thank you for being here, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Selina Ho, who is a colleague and senior research fellow from NUS, but unfortunately we don't move enough from our respective institutions, so it's a double pleasure that she's here visiting us from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. She specializes in Chinese politics and foreign policy, but has taken on this topic of transboundary water disputes, and particularly between China and India, which is, of course, of great interest to all of us. We're all interested in China and India, but we also have colleagues here working on other river and water disputes all across South Asia, whether it's India, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. So I think there'll be a lot of comparative expertise and interest here. Just very briefly to introduce the speaker, she has a book coming out, I believe, very shortly, something called Thirsty Cities, Social Contracts and Public Goods Provision in India and China. And she has published a number of very interesting articles. If you go to her website, you can click on them and look them up. And I was fascinated by the concepts that she's applying and developing, things like hydro-hegemons, the cases of India and China, the application of the two-level game, looking at how subnational governments have a role to play in what seems to be a bilateral state-to-state dispute, the whole issue of water politics, water security. These are all very traditional IR political science concepts, which are going to be fascinating discussion material for our presentation today. Dr. Ho has already pointed out a rather embarrassing error in the handout for today, but it makes for an interesting discussion. The topic was announced. The title is Power Asymmetry and the China-India Water Dispute, and it has been transformed by us into Power Symmetry. So we will, of course, discuss that. The last thing I would just like to say is that Dr. Selina Ho is also unusual and interesting for being not only a very senior academic and scholar, but coming to us also with a bureaucratic experience, which might give us an additional insight and angle to this particular topic. So thank you very much for being here, and about 40 to 45 minutes for your talk.
Thank you, Jivanta, for the very kind introduction. I'm actually not a very senior scholar, so that's very kind of you. I've known Professor Subhatra Mitra for quite a while now, when I was a graduate student. And I first met him, we were in the same conference in Hong Kong. I wasn't a graduate student, I actually finished them, but I was doing my postdoc. And he was very kind to invite me, and I'm very happy to be here. And I thank you all for being present here today. And I just want to first start off by saying that, to repeat that actually I'm, a Chinese foreign policy person. I'm less familiar with Indian foreign policy. So one of my key motivations for presenting at ISS is to learn from all of you, senior scholars, students, professors, about Indian foreign policy. And I suspect that when I start speaking about this topic, I'm going to get a bit of reaction. And the first reaction was power asymmetry and power symmetry. So, you might not agree with me, and I look forward to some of these views that you might have to help me fine-tune this paper. This paper is actually a chapter for an edited volume on China-India rivalry. And I was asked to write a chapter on the water dispute itself, mainly on the Brahmaputra. And so this is a draft of it, and it's undergoing review now. So I'm just hoping to get some feedback from everyone. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Ooh. Okay. It'll take a while to boot up, I think. Okay, that works. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, it's quite a bit of talking, but I'll try and keep within the time as much as possible. I'm going to start off by talking about why is water important between China and India. What makes it a topic that is significant? Why do we hear of people talking about water wars between China and India? And then I will come to my research questions, followed by my key argument, some of the theoretical frameworks that I use, and then I'll look at asymmetry between China and India on a broader level, and then followed by at the river basin level. And then the last question I have, which is on the conditions for the escalation of water dispute. And this is a question which I think I would appreciate very much, some of the thoughts that you might have on that. It's a bit more on the predictive side and asking, what could actually lead to water escalation of the water conflict into something like an outbreak of war. Is that possible? Okay, so why is water important? I think to start off with, we must understand that both China and India suffer from serious water problems. I have some figures up there that you can look at. Basically, China is just slightly above the water stress level, and you have India that's suffering from water stress already. And you can see that in China, the water crisis cost China about 2.3% of GDP. This is from an ADB report a few years ago, and about 1.3 percentage points is due to water scarcity and 1 percentage point to water pollution. And then in India, you have water pollution is about 80% of all its surface water. These are very serious problems, and it is predicted by some reports that have been made that by 2030, both countries will suffer from very serious water shortages with demand exceeding supply. So, looking at this circumstance, a lot of us take water for granted, and I think we don't realize how important water can be. So it is very important for livelihood for many users, and rivers are particularly contentious because they, especially transboundary rivers, they cross territories. They don't respect sovereignty issues. They don't look at territorial sovereignty, but they are shared resources and can have important implications for relations between states and among stakeholders. So in this context, you see that the waters of the Himalayas are therefore very invaluable. Both China and India share the Indus, the Sulej, and the Brahmaputra. And the focus of this paper is actually on the Brahmaputra mostly, because it's actually the most significant with a very high level of runoff volume. But not only is the fact that water is of economic value, it's a survival issue, it affects on economic development. The fact of the matter is that the Sino-Indian water dispute is very, very often mixed together with larger political and territorial issues. India views China using water as a leverage, particularly in the conflict with Pakistan. If you all remember last year, when when there were disagreements between India and Pakistan over the Uri attack, and India wanted to, Modi hinted about abrogating the Indus Water Treaty, China actually blocked a tributary of the Brahmaputra for the construction of the Lahore Dam at that time. Well, I personally think that it just happened to be coincidental. Mm-hmm. But I know that a lot of people view it as as China acting on behalf of Pakistan to exert pressure on India. We can discuss that later on if people have different views about that. And the other thing is that China is also involved in several infrastructure construction projects with Pakistan. And rivers also come into this, in play on this, because of the dams that are being constructed, but mainly the Chinese funding of the Daima Basa Dam on the Indus and the Bunji Hydro Project in the Indus and the Gilgit River in Kashmir. The other thing is that not all transboundary rivers are conflated with territorial disputes. But what makes it so sensitive and difficult in China and India's case is that there is the question of Arunachal Pradesh, a disputed territory. And very often you'll find that Arunachal Pradesh come into play because Arunachal Pradesh has really large water resources. And that India is very suspicious that China lays claims on Arunachal Pradesh because of its rich water resources. And for instance, in 2009, the ADB wanted to give a loan to India to develop a watershed in Arunachal Pradesh, but China actually blocked it. And that led to the Indians being very suspicious of why China is doing that. And they concluded that it has a lot to do with the water resources and territorial dispute in Arunachal Pradesh. And I think that on China's side, the reason why it wants to block the the ADB loan is precisely because I think it feels that the territorial dispute will be harder to resolve, that the negotiations over the line of actual control will become more complicated if Arunachal Pradesh would become more developed in its watershed. So these issues are all mixed together. And you'll find that in most of the rivers that come from Tibet, coming up from China into other parts of Southeast Asia, you will find that there is no issue of territories, which makes cooperation a lot easier. So this is one factor that is key in the China-India water dispute. So these are my 3 research questions, which I tried to answer in this paper. Is that, first of all, why are China and India not able to establish robust mechanisms for cooperation on the Brahmaputra River? And this is when I rely on the concept of power asymmetry to explain it. And similarly, for the second question, why, even though there is little transboundary water cooperation, why have not wars broken out? Why have wars not broken out over water? And again, I used the power asymmetry concept here. And then the third question, what are the conditions under which the status quo could change, leading to outbreak of war over water? So I personally think that war over water is very remote, but others here might have different views, and I'm very keen to hear those views. And what I'm going to try during the last part of this presentation is to talk about these conditions, and I would appreciate feedback on that, because this is the one that I think we'll have a lot more to debate about. So that's the interesting part. This is the predictive part of what we're looking ahead, what we have looking ahead. So the key argument is that the power disparity between China and India led to differences in perception, in particularly threat perception. And because of these differences in threat perception, there are also differences of levels of attention that each party pays to relations with the other. So that affects relations on a broader level, but it also affects the way they managed the Brahmaputra River and other rivers between China and India. And these differences lead to a vicious cycle of misperceptions. And it is these misperceptions that prevents the development of robust cooperative mechanisms. And, but however, despite this lack of cooperation and the existence of tensions and conflicts that flares up once in a while, armed conflict has not resulted because both sides have used certain strategies to prevent escalation of conflict. But having said that, I want to point out that there are conditions that can escalate the water dispute, and this we will discuss later on again. So what is this theoretical framework that I use? Basically, it's based on Bentley-Womack's theoretical framework on power asymmetry and the relations between China and Vietnam. So his work basically focuses, I'm not sure whether people are familiar with Womack's framework, because he's basically a China person. And he works on China's relations with smaller countries, particularly specifically on Vietnam. But he also worked on, his concept can be applied, for example, between Vietnam and Cambodia. It can also be applied between the United States and China. So we're not talking about just huge disparities in power, but also there could be a disparity that is not so huge, but it still has an impact on how the relationship work out. So he basically argues that asymmetry in threat perceptions result in different levels of tension, leading to misunderstandings, and these make robust cooperation difficult. But then he argues that a stronger state, because a stronger state can have very little difficulties, has a lot of difficulties eliminating a weaker state, it is likely that this relationship will be stable in the long run, despite tensions. Because you cannot, there are very few state deaths, per se. Very few weak states have been eliminated by the stronger states. So because of that, it's very difficult for one state to eliminate the other. You'll find that both sides will try to adopt strategies, and he calls them creating neutral zones, creating sleeves of normalcy, to try and manage this difficult relationship. While I agree with him that there are all these elements, strategies that are being used, including like inclusive rhetoric, routinizing and institutionalizing issues, relying on diplomatic rituals and historical precedents. These are basically the 4 strategies that he has talked about. One thing that he wasn't so clear in his framework is under what conditions can asymmetric conflicts come out? Because after all, China and Vietnam did fight wars. So what are these conditions that can lead to wars? And I think his theory is not so good on that. And this is when I rely on a slightly different set of literature, which is to look at what have scholars said about asymmetric conflicts, asymmetrical dyads, relationships, and how that plays out. And I think it's commonsensical in many ways that we know that the stronger is usually the initiator of asymmetric conflicts. Why? Because if you're stronger, it's likely that you will win the war, and therefore it is to your advantage to initiate a conflict. But the more interesting question is, why would weaker countries, weaker nations initiate war and run the risk of being defeated by a much stronger power, since the odds are probably against them? So a lot more scholars focus on this type of questions. What are the conditions under which the weaker side may initiate war? I think T.V. Paul has written about this. He talked about 4 critical variables that can cause a weaker country to initiate war. First of all, these 4 critical variables are limited political objectives first. Secondly, changes in short-term offensive capabilities. 3, great power reliance and involvement of third parties. And the 4th is when there are changes in the domestic structure of the stronger side, meaning that there's an opportunity because of changes in government or political parties on the stronger side, the internal chaos that result, the weaker side may initiate war. And you have also people like Steve Chan who talk about why weaker states initiate war. They initiate war because they actually expect an external power, a greater power, to come to its aid. So the expectation of outsiders coming to your aid may lead to the weaker side initiating war. And there's also a lot of literature on people like Andrew Mack and Ivan Aragintov that talks about how the weaker side can actually win wars. There are several conditions under which they can win wars. So all this literature fits into that question, this question of power asymmetry and why war can result with the weaker side initiating wars. Now, I want to state very clearly from the beginning that when I talk about asymmetry between China and India, I definitely recognize that it is probably very counterintuitive. And we know that both are rising powers, competitors for influence around the world. Both are great civilizations that are very influential in this part of the world. And if you talk about power asymmetry about them, it seems a bit odd. And I also want to be very clear that when I talk about power asymmetry between China and India, I would say that the power asymmetry is definitely a lot smaller than the kind of power asymmetry between China and its neighbors in Southeast Asia. Much, much smaller nations with much, much smaller economies and militaries in this part of the world compared to India. So, but I've looked at some of the figures, and people has written about this power asymmetry between China and India. That basically the economic, military, and in terms of population as well, you'll see that there is an asymmetry. There is a disparity that still exists, even though India is supposedly catching up in many ways. And we still don't know because there are a lot of variables about Chinese economy that are still in question and how things can turn out in the future. But as of now, there seems to be a gap. So what is this gap and how do we define power? So here we take the traditional definition of power. We take it as economic and military power and also demographic power. So economically, by the end of 2013, China's GDP expanded to nearly 4 times that of India. We're talking about US 13.39 trillion to US 4.99 trillion. So there is a substantial difference. Qualitatively as well, China's economy is very much industrial based. India's industry is slower in developing. India also, there's also a very large trade deficit that India runs with China. The trade relationship is very asymmetrical, with China exporting machinery, value-added equipment, and iron and steel to India, while India exports raw materials, primary products to China. So there is a very clear asymmetrical relationship, particularly in trade. And then militarily as well, in 2015, China's defense spending was 145.8 million, while India's was about almost 15 million. So there is, again, huge disparity. I think this defense spending is, of course, fueled by China's growing economy, and as a result of which you have more money to spend on the military. And this gap is quite significant. That's quantitative-wise, but also qualitatively as well. There is, China actually spends more money investing in power projection capabilities as opposed to India. And in a way, investments in India's military has been neglected, I think, in the last few years. People who specialize in Indian military, please let me know if you have different views on this. Population-wise, by 2022, we expect India to be catching up with China. So that led to a lot of people talking about demographic dividend, that India will enjoy a demographic dividend. That is true, but I think it's not just about quantity, but we also need to talk about quality. One of the key issues is in terms of HDI. HDI is Human Development Index, but this is measured by the UN. We are looking at issues like access to schooling, mortality years, and things like that. So in terms of, and access to basic goods and services. So in terms of HDI, what happened since 1980 is that China's HDI has consistently been higher than India's. So based on these kind of figures, I'm arguing that there is asymmetry in terms of development between the two countries. So this asymmetry in power and capacity leads to different levels of threat perceptions. And I think that for China, China does not perceive India as a serious threat. It considers India to be a regional power without global reach. But it considers itself to be a global power. And in its eyes, there are only a few global powers that are worth paying attention, most of its attention to, which is basically the United States, Japan, Russia, European Union, and itself. These are based on some of the papers that they have written years earlier on. But for India, I think in recent years, China has taken over Pakistan as the #1 threat. Basically, I think in this view is that that Pakistan is a threat only because China is the one that's supporting Pakistan. It sees China behind Pakistan, and therefore Pakistan is a threat only as a result of that. So in a sense, the #1 threat is China. And these kind of differences, the asymmetry in threat perceptions, you can find it in evidence, in solid evidence, empirical evidence, when you look at India's defense report and China's white papers, defense white papers. You'll see that the perception of each other is very different. India will have a lot of mention of China, but China's defense white papers barely talk about India. And I think you'll find that China's focus is really on its maritime borders, where its greatest threats are coming from, basically from the United States, from Japan, countries that he has suffered previously from, while it really wants to keep relations on its western and southwest borders as stable as possible, so that it doesn't have to deal with problems on both ends, from both sides, the east and the west. There's also general Chinese disinterest, and you can see it in media reports and journals. While on the Indian side, you'll see China being regularly mentioned in Indian media reports and journal articles as well. In a sense, India is not a priority for China, as a result of which, and that's precisely because, according to John Gover, I'm sure that Most of you have heard of him and his work. He did some really good stuff on China-India. And his argument is that India is not a priority for China, basically because the current status quo, the way that the power asymmetry between China and India is satisfactory to China. There's no need for China to want to change anything or to have, pay more attention or to be incentivized to cooperate, to have more robust cooperation, precisely because India is not a priority and the current status quo is satisfactory to itself. It is not threatened per se by India as much as it's threatened by the bigger powers on its maritime borders. I think that's what John Garber was basically arguing. Now, so one of the things that Brett Womack was talking about is that because of asymmetrical relationships, countries in these kind of relationships usually will adopt certain strategies to minimize misperceptions, to prevent the escalation of conflict. So what are some of these strategies? One of the key strategies is to employ inclusive rhetoric. And you can see plenty of that. You can see plenty of that whenever a statement is made about China-India relations. These, on the slides, these are some of the examples that I could find. Li Keqiang, during his visit in 2013, his visit to India, he said, without the simultaneous development of China-India, there won't be prosperity in Asia. Both countries view each other as partners for mutual benefit and not as rivals or competitors. Xi Jinping went to India and said similar things, global partners, the world's factory, world's back office. So this is inclusive rhetoric, both sides talking about how they can work together for the betterment of Asia. And Modi himself in 2015 said the re-emergence of India and China and their relationship will have a profound impact on the two countries in the course of this century. We have a historic responsibility to return this relationship into a source of strength for each other and a force of good for the world. The force of good for the world is historic responsibility. It's very inclusive. It's a very mission-oriented and a very inclusive form of rhetoric between the two sides. Now, another strategy that countries in asymmetrical relationships adopt to minimize misperception is to routinize issues, to institutionalize their interactions with each other, because that brings stability into relationship. We all know that from neoliberal institutionalist literature that basically institutions provide that kind of stability for cooperation. There's high-level engagement bilaterally, regionally, and multilaterally. At the economic level, you have the strategic economic dialogue, and there are several working groups that work on economic issues that form part of that. And on the boundary question, to seek clarification of the LAC, there's a joint working group as well. And then at the very ground level, you have military commanders from both sides of borders meeting periodically to discuss issues. The other tactic that Womack talked about is diplomatic ritual. High-level visits, a lot of the high-level visits, continue despite occasional flare-ups. We saw that during Xi Jinping's visit to India. We saw that also during Li Keqiang's earlier visit to India, that the visits went on. The atmosphere is a bit spoiled, but the visit continued. And then the last tactic that Womack mentioned was historical precedents. What does history tell you about how relationships have been managed? And he makes the point that countries that have a long history of managing their relationship with each other are likely to have more stable relations because they have precedents to look at. What is worrying is when new crises and new issues come about. But China and India have fought a war in 1962. And then after that, they managed to get their relationship back on track. It took a while, but their relationship went on track. So there is a long history of conflict management between them, and that helped to exercise the way that they manage each other. And basically, both do not want a repeat of the 1962 border war. It's not something that both like. And especially for India, there is a sense of inferiority that came from that border war. And I don't think it's a situation that it wants a repeat of. And neither does China, because it just destabilizes its western frontier. Okay, so that is the broad picture of relationship. This is actually the real part of the paper. and I only have 15 minutes left. Okay, so what is the impact of this asymmetrical relationship on transboundary rivers? So this is the Brahmaputra. It comes from Tibet, okay, and then it enters, this is the part known as the Great Bend. The Great Bend, and it enters into this part of India, which is Arunachal Pradesh. And then it continues on, joining the Ganges, leading into Bangladesh, leading to Bangladesh as the most downstream riparian. There are dams that are being built here, somewhere here, and also some of them are in the process of being built. There is also talk of a very, very large dam here that is supposed to be larger than the Three Gorges Dam, known as the Motor Dam being built, although I cannot confirm it. I mean, the terrain is one of the key issues why some of these things are very difficult to ascertain. There is a Zhangmu Dam that became an issue between them at some point, and I will elaborate on that dam in a little bit. So this is the general terrain that we are looking at here. So what is the asymmetry at the basin level? What is the shape? The shape is not just about economic and military power differentials. I think that is an important part. But also that China is the upstream riparian. So the geographical context is one of the reasons for the asymmetry. So the asymmetry has got to do with a lot to do with geography. China as the upstream riparian. Now, because of these geographical advantages that China enjoy and the fact that it has greater economic and military power than India, it results in differences in perceptions of tension at the transboundary rivers, at the level of the river basins itself. So India worries about dam buildings and the possibility of water diversion. China basically has two main interests in the Brahmaputra. First is in building dams, a series of dams, because of the great hydropower that the Brahmaputra, Yalongzangpu as it is known in Tibet, the great hydropower that exists there, and then the possibility of water diversion. That possibility, I personally think that's not likely to happen. We are talking about China's construction of the South-North Water Diversion Project, which basically has three routes. The first one is eastern, the second one is the central line, and the third one is the western line. But the first and the second one have been built, okay, but the western one has not been built. Basically, there's a lot of ecological implications, environmental implications. It's also very, very costly financially and also technically as well. So in my opinion, it is very difficult to build one and unlikely to be built. And I think the Chinese have repeatedly come out to say that they're not building it. And so far, I have not seen any signs of that being built. So that's the western route is the one that India is worried about. India also sees China using water as a strategic advantage over India, as leverage in the event of a conflict, you know, that like what happened with the perception that China deliberately blocked off a tributary of the Brahmaputra because of the Uri attacks, the incident coming up from it, the result of that. And I already mentioned Arunachal's rich water resources, the confliction of territorial and resource issues. And then there are also a lot of ecological and environmental implications. I've been on a trip to Assam in the northeast, in a place known as Dibrugarh. And I went to the north bank of the Brahmaputra. And if you were to visit the communities there, the villages there, they will tell you about the China floods. They describe the floods that happen as China floods, basically. Whether it's true or not is a different issue. It's a perception that the floods is the result of Chinese actions upstream. So this trap perception is there. And like I said, China is satisfied with the status quo, not just only in the broader relationships, but also with the way that there's a power asymmetry at the river basin level. So China is satisfied with the current situation. So because of that, it actually perceives very little substantive political and economic benefits from cooperation beyond its very low-level cooperation right now, which I will elaborate in a little while. It doesn't require Chinese, Indian help in building dams. It doesn't require Indian money to build dams or technical capability. So there's very little interest on China's part to do anything about stepping up cooperation. Although I do think that India will be more interested in stepping up some form of cooperation, getting and institutionalizing the management of the Brahmaputra. So, but armed conflict has not occurred, has not happened, so why is that the case? So again, you'll see that at the river basin level, this inclusive rhetoric, diplomatic rituals, historical precedents, institutionalization and routinization being played out as well. So you will find that China consistently denies all these diversion plans. It claims its dams are run off the river. Okay, run off the river meaning that it's just normal. It's not going to do anything to stop river flows. There are no significant effect from the dams, and that it constantly reassures the Indian side that it will take into account Indian interest in its water plans. And you can think of these things as desecuritizing water conflicts, and meaning to make water conflicts a normal political issue rather than a security issue. And you see both sides trying to do that. So the Zhangmu Dam was being built around 2010. Was actually being built earlier before. But it was only in 2010 that China actually admitted that it's building this, even though the Indian side had already seen all these satellite images coming out. They denied it, the Chinese side denied it until 2010. So when the news came out, what the Chinese side said was that Zhangmu Dam was not a project designed to divert water and will not affect the welfare and ability of water of the population in the lower reaches of the Brahmaputra. And these reassurances that come about, similarly, Wen Jiabao in 2010, he said certain things as well. You can read it on the board. And the Indian government itself also employs rhetoric that prevents escalation of tensions, but at the same time, consistently raising transborder rivers as an issue of concern to Chinese leaders. You can read these statements by itself as well. The water wars are actually in the Middle East. And you can imagine why. Management of the Jordan River is an issue, and it involves not just water as a resource, but water as a political issue. So the trend in the past is that wars break out when there are already troubled relations between riparian countries. And water is used as a pretext more often than not. Okay, we've seen that a lot of that in the Middle East. But if you were to look at all the Trans-Saharan River basins around the world, you'll find that there are more than 200 incidents of water cooperation and about 37 incidents of water wars. Very few, okay? And usually between countries with troubled relations. So having said that, we still need to find out what, when people say water wars, why? What are the conditions that can actually lead to that? So I'm arguing that there can be a combination of endogenous and exogenous factors that can lead to escalation of conflict. And the endogenous conditions basically are about the physical and economic conditions of the river basin itself, the Brahmaputra River Basin. And this is when the issue of water security, climate change, water scarcity, human security, economic development, food security comes into play. So if climate change results in greater water scarcity, you might find that violent conflict can result. Very famous scholar, Thomas Homer Dixon, he wrote about extreme scarcity. When resources are extremely scarce, violent conflict can result. And he actually said that the renewable resource most likely to stimulate interstate resource war is river water, precisely because rivers cross boundaries and can be used for many, many, many purposes. And he also said that war is most probable when the downstream state is highly dependent on river water and believes it has the military power to rectify the situation. He gave the example of Egypt and Ethiopia on the Nile. Egypt being the downstream country, but the superpower, the more powerful country, but downstream. So because it's more powerful and because it needs water, it's highly dependent on water because it's downstream, it has the capability to rectify the situation and conflicts result. So the question is, what are what are the conditions? What are the other conditions other than within the river basin itself? What are the external conditions that can lead to war? This is when we look at the broader relations between China and India. And can water be used as a pretext or as a catalyst for war? I don't think that a war over water itself is going to break out. But can water be used as a catalyst? I think there is a possibility, even though I personally think it's very remote. But please let me know your views. You might disagree with me, and I welcome any differences in views that you may have. And so what are these exogenous factors? I'm saying that China being satisfied with the current status quo actually might not be the one to initiate war, because it is satisfied with the status quo, and that is well documented. There is no need for it to change the status quo to its advantage. It's the upstream riparian. Why would it fight a costly war on its western and southwest borders when it has all these other problems on its maritime borders, where it sees its greatest threat coming from? But the next question is, in the China-India asymmetric diet, would India initiate war? It seems to me very unlikely. Okay, so this is when I turn to the literature on the weaker side initiating war. What could actually happen? I think that India is very dissatisfied with the status quo, not just in the broader relations, but with the current state of lack of cooperation and management in terms of managing the shared water resources. So far, attempts to change the status quo has been through persuasion, but there is always, changing status quo can take two forms, persuasion or coercion. And would it use force? That's a big question mark. The literature on asymmetric conflicts points out certain conditions under which the weaker may initiate wars. We might, if we were to turn to the power transition theory, we can adopt some form of that. And we talk about how a weaker state that is approaching, not naturally a weaker state, but a state that is approaching near symmetry with the dominant power might want to challenge the status quo. If it sees the dominant power being unhappy, being unwilling to accommodate its rise. I think in the past year, you see several instances of that, and I think India is very unhappy with China blocking its entry into the NSG, with China refusing to name, designate Masood Azhar as a terrorist. I think these Indians are very upset with that, and that these are seen as signs of China trying to prevent India's ascension. And if these were to continue, this current state of affairs were to continue, what could that trajectory lead to? And if we were to look at how India under Modi is conducting its foreign policy, it is conducting a much more robust foreign policy. It is reaching out to the countries that are traditionally at odds with China, with reaching out to Japan, the United States, Australia, to Vietnam. In fact, there is a book chapter that I've written about how China's perception of India may be changing because of what India is able to do in its foreign policy, getting the help of outside powers and getting the help of bigger powers, alliances. So if we were to look at what TV Paul has written, what Steve Chan has written, they have talked about how third powers, the expectation of external help might cause the weaker side to initiate conflict. Then we cannot totally discount the possibility of conflict. So is it possible that there could be water as a catalyst or pretext for war? Now I'm hoping to use that as this question as a way to generate discussion here, and I'll be very happy to hear your views. So let me conclude by, I'm in good time, yeah?
A few minutes.
Oh, what happened? Oh, okay. Let me conclude. I think that armed conflict over water is a possibility, even if it's rather remote. And I would not think that it will be just about water itself, because there's really no wars that have been fought over just water itself. We're talking about interstate. We're not talking about intrastate. Usually water is a pretext or catalyst for very troubled relationship already between two countries. Both sides, what I'm saying, so in order to ensure that both sides, that water does not escalate as an issue between the two sides. The two sides actually need to strengthen their cooperation with each other. And there are several ways that can go about doing it. Joint development, I think, is very difficult. Not to mention water sharing treaties, not to mention the setting up of a joint river commission. But they can do other things. They can do like research on climate change, disaster prevention, pollution control, and issues like environmental protection. I think it benefits both sides to be able to strengthen their cooperation in these two areas. I think that's the conclusion of my presentation, and I welcome all your feedback. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Dr. Ho, for a very comprehensive presentation. I'm sure there are lots of questions. We have about 45 minutes. Maybe I would ask the first question, if I may abuse my position. You mentioned quite a few times that China is the satisfied power. China is the status quo power. But supposing it's not, supposing it's the revisionist power, I mean, it has the capacity. We often hear this idea of diverting the Brahmaputra, whether that's actually possible or not. I have no idea. But I mean, it seems like if anyone, they can do it. So that to me sounds rather revisionist. So if China is a revisionist power in this setup, what does that mean for your scenario buildings of potential conflict and war? I mean, how likely is it that China might actually want to change the geography of this and become then that would be a major change in the status quo in favor of China? So that would be one question. Maybe we can collect a few if you like. Okay. Are there any other questions? Professor Mitra, Anish? Professor Mitra?
Selina, thanks very much for taking up an invitation which has been long overdue. You are addressing a very important problem, and you can see how important it is from the participation that it has brought in. River waters are an important issue in South Asia, and ISIS itself has already got capacity. In terms of Indus River, we have Faiza from Pakistan who has worked on water, and we have Amit who has just written on Tista, and we have you with us, and the entanglement of water with border is also an issue. Our board member, Mr. Girija Pandey, is working on this along with our two colleagues, Surya, who is not present here, and with, where did he go? Hiding there. Our Mandarin-speaking Malayali, Shrikant, who has done a PhD in baking. And the issue is also a South Asian issue, which is why His Excellency, the High Commissioner of Bangladesh is present, and Tista has emerged very much on the horizon. So what we are trying to do in ISAS is to develop expertise on this specific issue as to how to generate a level playing field where parties to a conflict can approach each other in a symmetric way. I mean, going from asymmetry to symmetry is what conflict resolution is about. And I'll just come at it from two angles. One is from the theory of games, the other negotiation theory. In the theory of games, the issue is, why isn't there more conflict than we actually see? It's because conflict partners reach what is called a Nash equilibrium, a solution where neither would be better off or worse off. So how do you get to a Nash equilibrium in a situation like this? The Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan is an example of a Nash equilibrium. In spite of the many wars between the two countries, India, the upriver country, has not used water as a weapon. Why not? I mean, that's one example that is given. The answer is that there is a third party involved, that's the World Bank. So two sides either discover in the long run that they're better off cooperating rather than conflicting, which is why egoists discover the virtue of cooperation. There are 4 conditions that lead to it: proximity, knowledge, reciprocity, and tit for tat. That's where these things happen, and some of these conditions are available and some are not. The other dimension to come to it is the Harvard theory of Fisher called principal negotiation, where you negotiate how to negotiate and transform positions into interest. So rather than saying, I hate her guts, you ask, what is this conflict about? So if you can localize the causes of conflict and see it entirely in terms of interest, you can find a solution. The size of the two parties is not an issue. Because that's what courts do and produce a level playing field. Look at Tista River between India and Bangladesh. India is a much bigger country, but India comes across for the reason that we can talk about as a party that is weaker on this particular issue. Even the government of India is not able to persuade the chief minister of Bangladesh, of West Bengal, to come to an agreement. So there are ways of transforming an asymmetry into a symmetry. But since this is a sort of beginning of a conversation, I'll stop there and see what other questions are coming. And when I say a few words at the end, I'll suggest some way of taking this further.
Let's take one more question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anish Mishra. Firstly, I want to say is that this presentation was very brilliant. Especially, you gave your analysis was very balanced and objective in nature. Okay, the things that you spoke about water being used as a pretext or as a reason for war when when the relationship is already very bad. The things that I think we should, instead of looking at water as a cause for war, we should look at water as a weapon for war, because especially when Modi talks about blocking the Indus River, it's more or less, it becomes actually a substitute weapon for the nuclear bomb, if you think about it. And and coming back to China-India relations, I think one point that you probably missed out in your analysis is that you should look at the relation China has with the neighbors of India, because China has better relations with India's neighbors than India's, and then the neighbors can then actually be used as proxies against India. Especially you see countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, they have a very hard time balancing the Sino-Indian rivalry. And just to add my view on a last point, is that based on my view, my observation of this area, I think probably the number one thing that can lead to war between China and India is the province of Gilgit-Baltistan, which is what India calls it the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And the thing about the Gilgit-Baltistan is because from there, the Karakoram Highway, actually, you exit Gilgit-Baltistan, you can take that and go to Central Asia. And if India actually, in their fervor of nationalism, they actually try to conquer back this province, that will be a cause of war. And I think the Brahmaputra River, after looking at your analysis, probably this can be used as one tool to safeguard Gilgit-Baltistan, because China and Pakistan, they cannot lose the province of Gilgit-Baltistan. Once Gilgit-Baltistan is lost, the entire CPEC project is over. China One Belt, One Road is also finished. So that road from Gilgit-Baltistan is very highly important, because from there you take Karakoram Highway and you can go into Central Asia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you want to respond to those three first.
Thank you very much for all your questions and then comments as well. Let me try and respond to some of these. So supposing China is revisionist and it does the water diversion project, what can happen? Well, I have to say that I really think that's very unlikely. So I heard from some of my Chinese friends that basically the South-North Water Diversion Project, which is a huge project that started in the 2000s. The central and eastern routes have been built, almost completion. I've heard from my friends in China that basically they have become white elephants. They are white elephants. I mean, the point of these diversion projects was to bring water from the south to the north. The reason is because the north lacks water, while the south has a lot more water. That they become white elephants because in interim time for the canals to be built, northern China has already developed water recycling and desalination capabilities. And you see that happening in Tianjin, the Bohai Basin, the Bohai Sea Basin. And they are able to do desalination and helped the industries that are in the north. But of course, there could be other uses for the water itself, and it is not, at the end of the day, it might still have uses for it. So what I'm trying to say is that I actually think that constructing the Western route will, first of all, be counterproductive. It is extremely costly, politically as well, with India and with, and you can imagine tunneling water canals through the Himalayas. So you can imagine the difficulties. But of course, having said that, China's construction capabilities are amazing. Nobody thought the Three Gorges Dam was going to be built, but they did build it. And China's infrastructure power is one of its greatest strengths. So I'm not saying that that will never happen. I think if that were to happen, I think we have to look at certain other factors taken into consideration. One of the key factors is actually how much of the water that comes from Yalongzangpo, that comes from Tibet, when it enters into India, how much of that portion actually contributes to the Brahmaputra? And one of the key arguments, now it's very difficult, I have to say that it's very difficult to measure these volumetric runoffs. There are very few accurate studies of these, and most of these studies are estimates. And most of the studies will actually tell you that when the Brahmaputra enters India, it gathers most of its water resources, the runoff, from the tributaries that are within India. So the contribution from China is actually not as much as some people thought it to be. I think that's a significant fact. I can give you some figures. I have it somewhere here. I just can't remember it now, but there are some figures on that. So in the end, what if a diversion were to happen, then the question is, how much affected is the downstream of the Brahmaputra? And I think actually the bigger problem is not so much India, but the problem will be Bangladesh. And Bangladesh problems are a lot harder than India's problems when it comes to the Brahmaputra River. Thank you for your comments, Professor Mitra. I'll be happy to work with whatever river stuff that ISS is wanting to start up. I'm very interested in this. I'm actually involved in a Track 2 dialogue. Just to let you know, I'm involved in this Track 2 dialogue between Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, and China as well. The participation from the China side, as expected, is very low. They have annual meetings, and it's run by a NGO. And I think there are several of these Track 2 dialogues that go on that try to promote understanding. So I can give you some names later on that might help you. And I agree with you in the sense that, how do you, definitely negotiation theory, game theory, all these will help. And the role of third parties, that's very important in the Indus River Treaty, why it came about, and that could actually survive a few wars. Even though on the ground, I think there's actually a lot of problems with the implementation of the Indus itself. It is problematic in several regards, even though that treaty has really survived many, many wars. And you were talking about transforming positions into interest. I recently published an article on China-Kazakhstan Transburi water rivers. That was published in February. And that's exactly the point that I was making inside the paper. Basically, how do you change the incentives for upstream riparians to cooperate? How do you incentivize, alter the payoffs, provide side payments for the upstream riparian to agree to cooperate? So the issue here is to tell them it's their interest to do so, but how do you ensure that they know it's their interest to do so? This is when you have to look at the leverages that you have. Kazakhstan, the cooperation between China and Kazakhstan in terms of Transburi River cooperation is actually very high. If I were to look at the range of cooperation between China and its neighbors, with India is the lowest, with Kazakhstan is the highest. We're not saying anything about perfect cooperation or complete cooperation, that there are no problems. There are existing problems too, but they actually have a river commission. They are almost concluding a water sharing treaty, unheard of in China's case. Why was Kazakhstan able to do that? So I did process tracing. I traced I traced the development of their relationship since Kazakhstan became independent since 1991. And you'll find that Kazakhstan has made itself useful to China many times again and again and again, over not economic issues per se, but over with issues that pertain to China's national security. We're talking about the Uyghur problems here, and those that pertain to its strategic issues, meaning energy cooperation, as well as cooperation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, balancing of Russia and the United States in Central Asia. So these are the kind of things that, with each step up in Kazakhstan's cooperation with China, China actually reciprocates by providing a step up in water cooperation. So that's an interesting thing. I could send you that article later on. So these are some of the thoughts that I think that downstream riparian countries can think about. What can Bangladesh offer India that India will be interested in? Right? What can India offer China that China can be interested in? And the difficulty between China and India is that I have spoken to Chinese scholars, and their point of view is that water issues will not be resolved until the boundary question is resolved. And the Dalai Lama issue is resolved, and the Tibet issue is resolved, meaning that it's very hard, basically. And these are the things that China are really interested in. So in a way, water is a leverage. It's a leverage that is using as a bargaining chip on the other issues. So it's not likely to give it up, and that's why cooperation is so difficult. Okay, so that's Rashomon to you, and respond to Anish. Anish, okay. Water as a pretext for war, certainly, and water as a weapon for war. I think that has happened in the Jordan River and things like that. And also, Saddam Hussein has used a similar tactic before against Iran. So using the domestic changes within Iran to create a situation such that using war as a pretext, as a weapon for war. I think I don't have any additional views on that. And you talk about the Belt Road Initiative. That's a very good point, because that ties in with all these infrastructure projects around India's periphery, and water is a key issue. Water is not just a key issue for China-India when it comes to the BRI, but also between other countries, China and Kazakhstan. BRI, water is going to be a factor in all these construction projects that goes on along all these border areas. And one of the things that China has really failed to do is to be very sensitive to how India feels about the BRI and about economic cooperation with Pakistan over CPEC. To China, CPEC is just an economic project with a country that's been very friendly with. It is mostly come out as part of the BRI initiative, but it is not cognizant of how India sees CPEC as a sovereignty issue. And that complicates the whole thing. I'm not sure whether this is a view that is in all the different levels of government and academic circles in China, but at least from what I can tell is that there is an insensitivity there. Or whether India sees the BRI as basically India is here, no BRI projects inside, but along India's periphery you have all these BRI projects. So you see how India feels, that basically China is surrounding it with, having all these little projects with all its smaller neighbors, but leaving it out entirely. But also in a way because India is not particularly interested in this project, suspicious of Chinese intentions of this. Now the issue is how do you ensure that both sides can come to some understanding and a meeting of minds on how India can leverage on BRI for its own growth and its purposes. And I think, again, you need real solutions for that. It's difficult, and a greater understanding is needed for that kind of stuff.
But you must recognize the difference between the mindset on the Indian side and the Chinese
Yes.
side. Because for China, they say that, what we do in Gilgit-Baltistan doesn't make a difference to the sovereignty of India.
Yeah.
Because we have not changed our version of the dispute. The land is there, we are
Yes.
just building a road.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
But for India, the view is different.
Yeah, of course. That's precisely my point.
China has told India, if you think it's your territory, then why are you unable to conquer it back? There's no way that you're ever going to capture it. So that's one thing that has to be recognized as well.
Yeah, yes, that's exactly my point, that basically there is differences in perception, that China sees the BRI basically as an economic project, while India sees it as there is a sovereignty issue involved, and that's where there's a gap in the perception of the whole issue. Yeah.
A mutual gap. So I have Professor Basu and then Mr. Pandey and yes, gentleman there. Professor Basu. Yes.
Thank you. Just to touch on this whole thing about the sovereignty issue and the difference of perception, I think the Indian perception should be looked at a little more deeply, in the sense that once the CPEC is in place fully as a functioning enterprise, then obviously from the Indian standpoint, China is no longer a neutral actor. It has an investment in that area, not only an economic investment, but by its very nature, a political investment also. So I would just wanted to clarify that.
Yes.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about is really about, again, going back to the issue raised by Jivanta on status quo, but from a slightly different angle. That is that, in fact, in the literature generally, being status quo tends to be equated with being stability oriented, especially in strategic interaction literature. But in fact, in the China-India case, where the border dispute is concerned, it seems fairly clear that China's status quo position is actually in favor of retaining a level of instability. And I say that particularly with reference to the LAC issue, where India has repeatedly called for resolution of the LAC, to the extent that Prime Minister Modi has publicly said that, okay, we can come to an understanding on the LAC without prejudice, he used these terms, without prejudice to China's position on the border dispute itself. And the Chinese position has remained unchanged. They don't want to resolve it. And the reason for this, I think, may be quite different, and that is to do with actually wanting to keep the pot boiling in order to, consolidate domestic support, to have domestic support as ballast for a regime which is, despite its apparent strength, also has important vulnerabilities. And finally, just a quick point, I agree with you that the prospect of war as a result of water disputes, or indeed any other disputes, is not really very likely. I just want to approach this from a somewhat different standpoint, and which is that both are nuclear weapons powers. Okay, and regardless of what one might view as some kind of imbalance between them, the fact is that balances don't really matter among nuclear powers. And well, we hopefully will come to a clearer understanding of this week or the next, where North Korea is concerned. But coming back to the India-China thing, because they are both nuclear powers, the likelihood of full-scale, rationally planned war is, I think, extraordinarily low and can be pretty much discounted. However, if we look at the history of state rivals who are nuclear powers, they do from time to time get into conflicts at a lower level. And two major conflicts which have occurred, well, major in the sense significant conflicts in which armed combat did take place. One was between China and Russia, Soviet Union in 1969, and then between India and Pakistan in 1999. So the real worry, I think, is not under what conditions war would take place, but more precisely under what conditions you might have some unexpected slide into some sort of conflict that threatens to assume larger proportions. That's all. Thank you.
Two more questions. Both of you, Mr. Gurjapan.
thank you for that presentation. It's very, very enlightening. I think the only model that we can see, probably where China is the upper riparian state, is the Mekong River. And they have a problem there as well, with the dams being built both upstream and downstream. And that is also resolved. But the Chinese have been actually quite accommodative, given that the lower riparian states are small, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Vietnam could be so I think there is a model there that the Chinese have not escalated this water issue, even with the Mekong, again coming out of Tibet. So there's probably a possibility that this will just lie as it is without getting escalated, because what we see in the Mekong side. The other issue that I have, whenever I've spoken to my friends in Beijing on this water issue, is that if they do build a dam, and if the electricity generation is shared with India in a way which suits the Indian side. The trouble is that the demand for electricity in the Indian side is not very high, because that is not where the action is in India anyway.
Northeast.
But if India could actually use that hydro electricity generously given by Chinese to allow the dam, that could be a solution in the not the near future, but at some stage. Of course, there is a challenge of building a dam there. That, of course, is but those plans are intact. The dam plans are there. They may not have built it because of whatever reasons. So if these two issues, if you look at it, the Chinese will either offer something in terms of, I don't know, 10,000 megawatts of electricity, or the way Mekong will get resolved or not resolved, I think that probably will hold back this issue of going to battle on this issue. There may be other issues, but not on this.
Can we take one more?
So something like a trade-off. And you're talking, when you talk about the dam, you're talking about a mega dam, right? Because there are smaller dams.
Those are run-of-the-river dams, the big
Okay.
ones.
Can we take one more just to
Yeah.
complete the circle?
Mine was on the nuclear symmetry between, so it's already been covered. So.
Oh, okay.
Okay, then Mr. Anyat maybe can come in.
One is the major issue of water disputes between India and China is sharing of datas, because nobody knows how much water flows. At Namcha Barwa, when where this Brahmaputra enters into India, 165,000 cubic kilometer of water is being released.
Right.
We don't know how much water is there inside China and what is there. Secondly, there's a water commission in India. They feel that India provides 2 million rupees, Indian rupees, to China per year to share data. But those data are not very reliable, because you know what happens that within 1 hour the water water release keeps on changing, so it's very unreliable data. And they also feel that the data is provided on Wednesday changes on Thursday or Friday.
Yeah.
So it's that. Then there's always a thing that India wants to have some sort of agreement with China that you have to release such a quantity of water without any problem, like we have with Bangladesh.
Yes.
India Bangladesh Ganges water treaty, where India has to release such an amount of water. But Chinese side feel no, it's okay with MOU. And MOU, what diplomats say, it's just a piece of paper. It's nothing more. And secondly, thirdly, I want to ask that there are always chances, although there are lots of cooperation and lots of treaties, but when water issue come up to certain level, then maybe the states feel that no, we are not going to obey with this treaty, because what happened with IWT in 2016 September, when India said that no, we are going to, we may look after the treaty. First it said that we are going to scrap the treaty. So these are the issues. And thirdly, when you say that water war, I don't believe on water wars, but yes, water will remain a cause for disputes. It may be used as a mean against the lower riparian by upper riparian, but it will remain cause not for war. Thanks.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions per person.
More like comments, actually. I think most mostly. Let me try and answer some of them. Wait. Professor.
Professor had the point about the nuclear aspect taking out the importance of the asymmetry, because isn't that a stabilizing?
Yeah, so lower level conflicts are actually much more possible than full scale war, which I totally do agree with you. I mean, one of the key issues, even on the maritime borders, we're not talking about a deliberate war breaking out between China and other, South China Sea claimants, but that drags in all the major powers. But we're talking about local conflicts becoming bigger than local conflicts, skirmishes leading to an outbreak of war rather than directly going to war. So I think you're trying to say here is that the lower level conflicts escalating into war, and I think that's where that's the point I'm actually making. How does these local conflicts can lead to a greater armed conflict? And I'm not saying that. I agree with you. A full-scale war is very unlikely, but you might see a border skirmish or of some form over water. And what I'm actually more concerned about is people who actually argue that there can be outright wars coming out. People like the famous Brahmaputra. So I don't know. I hope nobody is friends with him here or very good friends or something. But which I basically do not agree with him. Asia's battleground. And I think that it's more warmongering than anything else. So what I'm trying to do here is to look at how I want to make it a slightly more nuanced in the sense that I'm trying to talk about what can escalate, what could possibly escalate. And I did not really define whether the war was it's going to be a total big war or a border skirmish. But we're talking about a military conflict, basically. The other question about the Mekong River and unlikely to escalate, I think that I totally agree with you. It's really, I'm not entirely sure whether that can be considered a model for cooperation. It's a model for joint development of a river basin. And it's not without problems, but it is very good in the sense that there is the Greater Mekong sub-region, but remembering that China is not a member of the Mekong River Commission, which deals with sensitive aquatic water standards, dam building restrictions, things that China do not want to be used to tie its hands. And there is all these infrastructure projects that goes on, the use of transmitting of electricity that can go to Cambodia or some Laos and not necessarily back to China itself. Definitely you can do trading of electricity. We have seen that quite a bit on what India does with Bangladesh and the Ganges. China does also a bit of that with Kazakhstan, where it decides that some of this electricity will go to the other smaller riparian than itself. So I agree with you. I agree that this is a possible trading off of these things. And then I need about sharing data. Thanks for the information that that India actually provides 2 million rupiahs to China's side for sharing data. So the point that you're making is that the data is not reliable, but more of a case of technical difficulties, is it not? It is a technical issue more than, is it a deliberate China deliberately not delivering our data, or a technical issue? To me, it seems like a technical issue more than anything else. I agree with you, having lots of treaties and institutions do not mean that cooperation is perfect, because there's always an implementation issue. But in the water literature, the argument that is being made is that where there are institutions, it's better that there are institutions than there are no institutions. Because institutions do provide a certain level of stability. It does not resolve all the problems, but it does help to stabilize relationship. And the other thing that the water literature always talks about that will help to improve the cooperation between states is that there is a third-party involvement. And you can see that in the example of the Indus, where third-party involvement helps to arbitrate, to negotiate, and creates incentives for cooperation. And I just want to point out here that local governments play a very big role, because when you talk about the sharing of data, I think about the Tibet government. I think the Tibet government is very different from the other local governments. In the Mekong River, you had the Yunnan local government. And I think that Yunnan provincial government plays a very active role in the management of the Mekong. In the case of the Brahmaputra, I don't think the Tibet government plays a very big role, primarily because Tibet is a national security concern, meaning that central government controls a lot more what's happening in Tibet, which means that Tibet government does not have as much power as the Yunnan government. Yunnan government, deals directly with Laos, with Vietnam, with Thailand, directly on many issues. And the development in Mekong is being driven by Yunnan province, Yunnan province's needs. In the case of Tibet and the Brahmaputra, that's why the Brahmaputra is such a difficult issue, because Tibet is a national security concern. The central government is involved. There are a lot of all these other considerations, territorial disputes, that are not involved at the Mekong River. And there's a whole history of cooperation between China and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is traditional backyard of China. It has a long history of comfort of dealing with ASEAN countries. This is very unlike the situation in South Asia. There is no robust, other than SAARC, which is not actually very robust. There's no real mechanism to manage this relationship. So these are factors that play into the relationship, the management of water as well. Water is really just a subset of larger domestic issues, a subset of larger, broader political relations among states. It's not about water itself, but has to do a lot more with water, a lot more than water.
Okay, thank you. I think we've covered a broad range of issues, and don't worry, Professor Mitra, I'm going to hand back to you for your. Oh, you have another question? Do you want to?
I will take a third round because His Excellency hasn't had a chance to ask a question.
Would you, of course?
Thank you. Actually, I'm in a listening mood, and this is a very interesting topic. And when I saw this flyer, then I thought that I must make time to attend it, because I see a lot of similarity in the situation between India, Bangladesh, and China, India. It's both are. It's the very power asymmetry issue you can impose on both the situations. But then perhaps we've been able to create a situation of mutual trust and work with both of us. And perhaps this has led to resolution of one water sharing issue, and perhaps the second one is coming, so it's long awaited. And our colleague here has written a paper. I read it very thoroughly. It was just prior to the visit of our Prime Minister to India, where there was high expectation from home that perhaps we'll be able to resolve the remaining disputes. But what I would like to say here is that we have been discussing this issue, keeping perhaps one issue, one aspect totally out, and that is the legality aspect of it. And we are not bringing into consideration or discussion about the due share of all the riparian countries. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough development of international law, largely because what you have said, the power asymmetry and the upper riparian states being mostly the influential and stronger countries. And when it comes to negotiation of an international treaty, again, this powerful countries, stronger countries play a pivotal role. So that's why perhaps we don't have a good international framework in water sharing issues. We do have one convention, but it's very, very small, and not many countries have a state party to that. And also it's not a very strong one which can guide the sharing issues or disputes of water sharing. Then I think this is perhaps one issue. Eventually, if we reach to a point that most of the provisions will be transformed into a customary law, because I think there is common understanding that we have a share on a common river. I mean, what will be the percentage or how it will be divided? Maybe there are disputes about that. So I don't know. Maybe this is something which can act, if not a third party, but a third force in terms of not taking the water dispute issue to a level of war among countries. So that's what I thought I should.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I actually have to say that I think India's water laws are in a much better shape than China's water laws. There is actually very little. China has hardly said anything about transboundary rivers, which means that actually it doesn't place a lot of emphasis on the management of rivers precisely because it's upstream. On many of these rivers that flow through Asia, 14 of the major international rivers Asia comes from Tibet. So it has very little incentive to address the issue of transboundary rivers. India does a much better job in this instance. It has water sharing treaties for sure. And there are efforts to do this. Of course, it's not perfect. There is always a problem when, both sides suffer from same problems. Both sides have many bodies involving in the management of international rivers, but without someone having a proper authority to deal with it. And that has helped. That has not helped the legal infrastructure. But I have to say that India does a better job than China in this regard.
Lovely. I have asked for a few minutes to say a couple of things, then I'll hand it back to the chair who will give you a gift and thank you properly and get a round of applause. 2 points I wanted to make are, first, one of the functions of ISAS is to provide a platform where stakeholders can meet and talk about issues which arouse great passion within the 4 walls of freedom that academic institutions offer. And you have chosen to talk about a topic which arouses great passion, and we have been able to talk, thanks to your presentation, with unsentimental lucidity about an issue. In course of your conversation, I've seen how much more clearly I can see how to disentangle complex issues. So I'm very grateful that ISAS is being seen more and more as one of those platforms where people, where stakeholders like high commissioners and senior colleagues who have written books can come, and colleagues from other institutions, because we are in an island. We should not become islands in our own right. As NTU or LKY or ISAS, we should be able to cooperate. And this is something that I've been very keen on. And in the 2 years that I've been here, I'm trying to do more and more of it. The second issue is to generate new knowledge where there is domain expertise. There are several institutions in Singapore who are concerned about these issues, which have expertise. To have you here, Rajesh, is wonderful. And the ministries like that, because the ministries fund us all. And I would like to suggest that LKY and maybe Rajaratnam and ISAS should join forces on fleshing out what you called, you have a very nice concept there, robust mechanisms. Not about all the issues in the world, but about river waters. Because we have got enough knowledge already. I mean, just look within India. How many states are going to the Supreme Court for solution of river waters disputes? So there are robust mechanisms which require norms of conflict resolution and institutions to impose those norms. And such things can work. Look how quickly the ban on smoking in public places has come. What you needed was a norm that smoking is harmful to health, conflicts are harmful to political health, and mechanisms from fines to social disapproval and so on. So such things have happened in our lifetime, and river water disputes can also be managed. Look at Europe. Earlier you told me that you don't agree that we can borrow European norms for Asian use. Why not? It's a question of rationality. After all, don't we know from Hobbes that conflict is harmful and you may win in some cases, but you lose in others. On the average, it's best to have a third party called the Leviathan, who then carries the monopoly of legitimate violence. I'm not dreaming about world government at all. I'm talking about rational people learning from other arenas and bringing that knowledge home. No one is better off all the time. I mean, India may think India is better off in Sindh and Tista, but not in Brahmaputra. And one other thing I've learned is the nuisance that local or regional governments can be. National governments may want peace, but what power does Delhi have to order Kolkata? Or, I don't know, I said that Tibet is a national security zone. Maybe the central government has more power there than in Mekong or Yunnan. But again, federalism is coming in as yet another parameter. So I was suggesting privately to you and publicly now that we should aim at a panel discussion of the various institutes in Singapore, pooling their resources on river waters dispute governance mechanisms, and produce a nice discussion paper to start with. Then the expertise that we have about specific rivers, Tista or Sindh or Brahmaputra, can come together in not just one session, but maybe half the session. But that's something I'm going to work on and send a proposal to you and to you, Rajesh, and other people, and see how far we go. So I'll hand it back now to Jiva to thank you properly and give you a gift.
Yes, this is our tradition at ISAS to send you home with some presents, and we have two books to give you. One is Expanding the Water Aspect to the Ocean and the Blue Economy, right, which was written by the former president of Seychelles, who was a guest at one of our events. And this is an in-house publication by one of our colleagues, Dr. Palit, who's not here, about the potential of trade on overcoming these intractable issues. So thank you very much, and please join me in giving you a round of applause.
Thank you all for being here.